This week on the podcast, I'm bringing you segments of a recent interview I did on year-end tax planning tips with Sean Mullaney. He's the FI Tax Guy, FITaxGuy.com. So here's today's interview segment with Sean, where we discuss donor-advised funds. Let's talk about year-end tax planning strategies. So what is top of mind for you is what you're talking about with your clients, maybe what you're talking about on your YouTube channel as we approach the end of the year?
I put it in three buckets, right? There's the bucket of act sooner rather than later. There's the bucket of, well, we could probably get that done by December 31st. And then there's the bucket, well, we could probably wait till April 15th of next year, right? So very top of mind would be two things that I think most of the listeners are going to want to think about very much sooner rather than later, especially if they're listening to this in November or early December. And the first one is a donor advised fund contribution. That is very powerful. So what are we talking about there? We're talking about a charitable contribution. It goes into a donor advised fund, which is a great little mechanism for many retirees, many late career workers, where you say, you know, I want to give a significant amount to charity, but I don't want to do it all at once. What I want to do is get a big tax deduction at the end of the year. And maybe I have an investment that has a big capital gain. So maybe I could avoid that capital gain and get a nice tax deduction. And the donor advised fund facilitates that. You know, say, Ashley, in 1995, you bought some Apple stock and you say, oh boy, I got a big capital gain in that Apple stock. I don't want to sell that and trigger that capital gain. What you could do is move some of that Apple stock to a donor advised fund. And it's a in-kind transfer. In-kind's a financial planner way of saying that actual stock, you do not sell it first. That stock or some of those shares go into the donor advised fund. That accomplishes two things. One, it gets the capital gain on those shares. That's eliminated for all of human history. That's good news. And second, it gets you a nice juicy tax deduction. And then third, it has this nice feature of funding a donor advised fund that you can then use for routine or special charitable contributions whenever you want.
Right. That's why I love them so much. Other than the tax deduction, is that it can be overwhelming to decide like whether you have a big stock position, or a lot of times people will fund these with large contributions. Maybe they sold a business or they sold something where they have this big windfall. And they want the tax deduction that comes with a charitable contribution. But I love the donor advised fund because it decouples the giving to the charity with getting the tax deduction. So it's like the money can go in that account. It can sit for a while and it can continue to grow too. So you can end up giving more over the long run than if you just wrote that check in that year. Yeah. And I feel like this isn't talked about a lot, at least in like the world that I live in, because most of my clients or people who I have the conversation with maybe the first time, they've never heard of it before. And I'm the first person telling them about it. Was that your experience too? Do you feel like it's underutilized and maybe like the best kept secret in like tax deductions?
It is a great secret. And you know what it does, Ashley, you touched on this. It normalizes the relationship between donor and charity, right? Because no one wants to go to their favorite charity and say, hey, here's $20,000 and you take this and don't be in touch for the next 4 years. And then maybe 4 years from now, I'll give you another $20,000, right?
Just don't contact me.
You want to give, for those of us who are religious, right? You go to church, they pass out the basket and you want to contribute every week or every month. So few of us want to give once and only once and then never be in touch. We want to give sort of with some sort of routine and we want to normalize that relationship. The donor advised fund gets that deduction on your tax return in 1 year, and then you can go to the standard deduction going forward. Now, one practical consideration here, Ashley, is donor advised funds are run by financial institutions. They have deadlines for executing. So let's say Ashley has that Apple stock. Hopefully you do, Ashley. I haven't looked at your portfolio, but hopefully you do. And you want to get that deduction on your tax return in 2024. I would tell you, go to your donor advised fund sooner rather than later to initiate that transfer, because the funds are not open for business on December 31st
Right.
to take that. They usually institute deadlines, oftentimes in late November, to say, we can guarantee you'll get this deduction. This will happen during 2024 if and only if you initiate the transfer of the stock, the appreciated security, by a certain date. So that's part of the
Right.
reason I raise this to the listeners' attention of, I'd be thinking about this sooner rather than later. Look, you have to be charitably inclined, you have to think about that. But yeah, Ashley, it's a great little planning device. And you're right, it does not get enough attention.
The last thing I think I'd mention too about the donor advised fund that I think is important and a lot of people maybe might dismiss initially, but they shouldn't, is that people think in order to go through the trouble of setting up a donor advised fund, you have to have large, massive donation or big position in whatever stock you have. And that's actually not the case. So if you're charitably inclined, even if it's just a smaller amount, I think working with your tax advisor to make sure that you're maximizing the tax benefit in that current year. But yeah, you don't have to be donating millions of dollars or even hundreds of thousands of dollars. I've had clients set up donor advised funds with much less than that, and they still get the tax benefit and they still have the ability to fund the charities and the causes that they care about over the long run.
Yeah, Ashley, it's interesting. My understanding, and go to their websites, don't take my word for it, is that currently Fidelity and Schwab have no minimum initial contribution requirement for a donor advised fund.
Yeah.
So you could, in theory, open a donor advised fund with them for a very modest amount. Now, as a practical matter, we often try to size it up to the standard deduction or standard deduction less any other itemized deductions, your state taxes up to $10,000, any other charitable contributions. We're trying to get you to itemize your deductions in the year of the donor advised fund contribution. And then, it's sort of a bunching strategy.
Right.
Get a bigger one-time deduction. And then in year 2, year 3, year 4, go on to the standard deduction, which is currently relatively high. So, but you're absolutely right, Ashley, that it really isn't designed for the multi-million-dollar donation at all. It's more of a retail planning opportunity.